Hello and welcome to the seventh in the series on leftism and climate change. My name is Max Reynolds and I'm the author of The Revolutionary Renaissance, a study on the dialectical evolution of totalitarian thought. You can find more of my work at maxoreynolds.com. So in the last video we explored two interesting ideas. One was the various contradictions established between male and female, or between the revolutionary society and the ecological environment, and how the connections between these and the consciousness, the understanding of them, could be in turn dialectically reformed and then brought together to generate an ecofeminism. And it's with this new movement in the dialectical philosophy, and in this particular section among dialectical philosophers, is the revival of essentially more religious roots to the now neo-Marxist, post-structuralist, whatever part of the sequence in the dialectical movement you want to describe it. But the interesting thing is that it's in a sense returning to its roots. I'm going to be putting out other videos on Marxism and how its moral precepts are the inversion of the Ten Commandments, so that one's coming up. Another interesting thing that we obviously looked at was Aaron Gare, and whilst I strongly disagree with Gare in some of his interpretations and understanding of Marx, figures like Derrida and Foucault, the one thing that is possible through the myriad secondhand sources that he's likely read is to abstract out and to understand obviously some of the principles, and then to take those and apply them as a different kind of strategy towards environmentalism. So this isn't a direct kind of engagement with Engels or Marx's original premises. If you can recall back from some of the earlier lectures, we looked at how the assumption in Marxist theory is that because there is obviously consumption of resources, that this is essentially an unending stream, and that humans are essentially something akin, or capitalists and private property owners are something akin to locusts who will strip the earth bare and turn it to a desert. Whereas in postmodernism, there's obviously the linguistic description and all our cultural understanding, literature, artwork and things like this that portray our past relationship with nature, but also can be used to convey threat. So this is the anti-utopia, it's the eco-apocalypticism. But in turn, these can be used to motivate people, understand where power is currently exerted through discourses in language itself, through the way that teaching takes place, and to then use this obviously to reform people's consciousness. So to apply your dialectical movements to the discourses, the ideas, the concepts that people are taught, the way that people are taught, what's deemed appropriate for children and youth to see in terms of the wider world, and then to use this obviously by moving towards a predetermined goal. Of course, those goals can vary between whatever dialectical discipline you're looking at. The ecofeminists will come at it from a certain perspective as well, which would likely want to lay low and subdue men like Aaron Gare, whereas somebody coming out from more of a post-structuralist perspective but less focused on the ecofeminism would be perhaps more emphasising more control over language. The two ultimately complement one another. They have slightly different emphases, but the interesting thing to see was also essentially the revival of one of Engels' ideas. Engels, when speaking of one of the revolutions previously, particularly that of the ones, I believe it was in Hungary and France, he stated that those who didn't join the revolution, their new purpose come the revolution was to perish, and that's it, that their entire purpose is simply to die and to yield to the revolution. So the interesting thing in Engels' comment, however, is the rendering down that the revolution can manifest itself at a national level and among a people. And that's quite interesting when you compare Marx as in the lineage of Hegelians to a neo-Hegelian such as Giovanni Gentili, who likewise used Hegel's framework but more to develop Italian fascism, which is kind of an attempt to unite collectivism and monarchy So that's in the Italian system. And so what emerges as a kind of environmentalist nationalism can quite directly be compared to ecological fascism. We can kind of see the roots of that in whether it's Bookchin's ideas or whether it's Barry Commoner's ideas, where essentially all life has to be oriented around ecological values and principles which conveniently dialecticians define in the abstract, nice and vague, but then force everyone to conform and live to those in the particular. So we are seeing, you would see more of an ecological fascism with, high coordination between state and people, private enterprise, so on and so forth, social values, less emphasis on private ownership, and these all have massive implications for your rights, your ability to, your duty to use freedom of speech, to dispense with error, and to reject tyranny, and so on and so forth. For now, this is going to be the last video where we're going to be looking into a substantial amount of dialectical philosophy. In the next ones, we're going to shift to the ideas of the UN and the World Economic Forum, things like global citizenship. But for now, we're going to focus on Donna Haraway. And so this, again, in a dialectical movement is quite interesting. It's the development of technology and a new kind of humanity. But once we go through the process of generating technology, we've often made tools that are external to us, but the degree of development and human understanding, particularly of things like chemistry, biology, the ability to integrate electronics and other things into the human body is obviously more prevalent, and at the moment there's a lot of development going on in this area. So technology previously developed and generated externally is then integrated back into the human themselves. So it's a bit of a change, and obviously when it comes to brain and things like that, it's going to be quite important. Rosie Braidotti, she likewise has ideas which are quite similar to Donna Haraway's. One of the key principles, which is always important to hold in your mind, is the dialectical movement, particularly the alchemical aspect, where you are taking something raw and trying to sublimate out of it something higher, something purer, something of greater value. So in the last video we spoke about how there's essentially a stance prevalent all throughout the Hegelian literature, and it's kind of an inverted echo of the Christian idea of a soul with fleshy trappings, but here it's strict materialist, and the idea that you can overcome your past human nature. This is the idea of the proletariat, is 1 foot in the past, 1 foot in the future, and then supposedly being capable of constantly marching forward based on the ideas. So you move from being human to post-human, you move from being a human to kin or a cyborg. So the older generations, the older form of human is steadily made redundant. And of course, if you're thinking more along the Canguilhem, Donna Haraway was a student of Canguilhem, obviously kind of similar ideas also in Bookchin with technology being a tool of the revolution. So technology should be pushed forward in order to make the conservative old form of human in society unstable, to give the advantage to the revolutionaries in order to be able to force the alchemical process on people, society, so on and so forth. But the interesting thing that again it pops up, and it shouldn't now be a surprise, but is the idea around new religion. So there is some aspects there. So Donna Haraway and deconstructing the human. So let's look at some of Haraway's ideas. This essay is an effort to build an ironic political myth faithful to feminism, socialism and materialism. Perhaps more faithful as blasphemy is faithful than as reverent worship and identification. At the centre of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. So this is quite an interesting paragraph, obviously, again, raising the idea of religion, mythology. So the essay being an effort to, again, construct something, but you can recall in some of the previous videos, Sartre had mentioned whether a mythological or a philosophical route to a new phase of dialectical materialism was required. this is an interesting synthesis, because certainly among the post-structuralists there is a lot of the mythological emergent. That's clear in the ecofeminism, and Haraway is a feminist, but this is a kind of like a technological form of feminism united with the not necessarily ecofeminism right at this point, but the allusion to socialism is the same when we consider that this is in the dialectical tradition. That is obviously the movement of consciousness. It's the ideas of sovereignty. It's the collective sovereign. It's the knowing that you are in a dialectical process, that you need to have a dialectical consciousness, that the world around you can be reformed by dialectical means, so on and so forth, but also the materialism. And so it's those little cluster of ideas together that you can helps to recognize the dialectical basis, the lineage back to Marx that's latent within the system. But when it starts to say things like perhaps more faithful as blasphemy is faithful, this is quite interesting, because it's suggesting, well, the suggestion that blasphemy is faithful would suggest to me more the blasphemy is faithful in relation to the thing which rejects God. It's the allegiance to the inversion of God, or the rejection of God. So it's not the reverent worship and identification, it's the irreverent worship. So it's the more of the tearing down, revolution, destructive kind of aspect. And at the centre of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. So you've got this cascade of, consistent with the Marxist tradition, obviously with the consciousness, the ability to alchemically reform yourself materially, and of course in Marx's original system there was the reintegration of divinity into humanity. And then of course perhaps the faithful as the blasphemy is faithful, blah 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 blah, is quite consistent with an inversion of that. It would reference obviously the figure of the one who is at war with God, so this would be Satan, but most particularly I suppose Lucifer. Luciferianism is, the idea is not to worship Satan, but would be to become the highest of the rebels against God. So at the centre of my ironic faith, my blasphemy, is the image of the cyborg. Of course, the cyborg is something which is a dialectical union between various man-made components as well as the human themselves. But so it's the creations of the human, so this would be the lower being, integrated back into the human itself to then create the cyborg. So if at the centre of her ironic faith is the blaspheming, is the blasphemy of the cyborg, then the origin, or the centre of the faith rather, is something that you as an individual can become. This paragraph, once you kind of begin to pull it apart and you understand the broader framework, is an excellent demonstration of essentially something that has already been parsed out quite heavily by Marx and Engels. But the interesting thing to note is that the cyborg is it's a chimerical being. You can kind of argue how chimerical we might be as technology develops and things like this, but when you're alluding to a kind of a chimera, that's the offspring of Typhon and Echidna. Those are mythological deities in from ancient Greece, but are quite useful to recognise some of the connection between the mythology that's latent in ecofeminism and then some of the ideas that are being positioned here. You know, it's not a positive entity that is, you know, might be said to be the offspring of Gaia. It's actually something that's a bit more hostile, and of course you've also got the aspect of faith and worship, the blasphemy of self-worship being integrated into this. So the basis of a new subjectivity, truth and politics in a post-gender world. So the interesting thing, even here in 1985, so this was before I think some of Gail Rubin and Judith Butler's developments when we come to gender and collapsing the distinction between male and female, but the movement to being the cyborg is the movement past sex. but even further is past gender. So it's fundamentally making the distinction between human and cyborg so it's a vertical distinction rather than a horizontal distinction, because it's a qualitative change between the fundamental being of one entity from being a human to a higher entity being a cyborg. So post-revolution here you lose the distinction between the genders in a sense, so masculinity and femininity are collapsed together. When we recall some of the ideas, whether it's in Carolyn Merchant or other thinkers, it's got this Gnostic dialectical synthesis to it, something which is counted and treated as true knowledge. Unlike the hopes of Frankenstein's monster, the cyborg does not expect its father to save it through a restoration of the garden, i.e. through the fabrication of a heterosexual mate, through its completion in a finished whole, a city and cosmos. This is quite interesting again. So Frankenstein's monster is alluding to obviously the creature, which is a patchwork of different human parts, which is brought together by the scientist, the person with specialism, abstract knowledge, different kinds of techniques, who is essentially imitating God and creation. But here, Frankenstein's monster is there's obviously details to the story and things like this, but the contradiction between Frankenstein's monster and the cyborg is that the Frankenstein's monster doesn't want Frankenstein's monster wanted to have a mate, so it wanted a partner. Fundamentally, it's a kind of a tragedy driven by a kind of love, or some kind of shadow of love, but Frankenstein doesn't generate a partner for the monster, and obviously everything kind of goes haywire after that. But in distinction to this, the cyborg is not expecting to come to a kind of utopia, or that something external, such as God, is going to restore the garden. So there's no kind of heaven or anything like this. There's no re-entry into Eden after death. So it's obviously something which again is rooted in the material, and it's going to reject the fabrication of a heterosexual mate. So again here, the cyborg, part of what defines it is its non-heterosexuality and its non-genderedness. So when you're starting to get into these ideas, you're actually, if you can imagine that the proletariat, there's prior to the proletariat, there's the development of a philosophy which, when it comes into contact with people's consciousness, can thereby generate a proletariat. So the old society and the proletariat coexist, but then the purpose of the proletariat is to destroy the old society, destroy themselves, move into a new kind of form of reality and a new society with whoever's left. But here it's taking the same and doing this with humans to begin with, and so going beyond humans, but then moving beyond sexuality and gender. So we can imagine that not only is this the immediate change, but there's a dialectical movement whereby the intention would be to bypass the human, organic, fleshy aspects altogether. So it'd be kind of and ultimately, if it were possible to take consciousness and to create an image of it, or to transfer it into digital storage, then it might be possible to have some sort of convergence event between all these different consciousnesses, or that they you can all talk to each other in simulations and live infinitely. So the cyborg would not recognize the Garden of Eden. It is not made of mud and cannot dream of returning to dust. Perhaps that is why I want to see if cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust in the manic compulsion to name the enemy. So as I've just said, the cyborg would not recognise the Garden of Eden. So even if the information was presented to it, it would not be able to recognise it. It wouldn't see it as the Garden of Eden. That's as far as in the Marxist tradition is a false promise. because it implies creation. So when you're in the Marxist tradition, you've got the idea of continual self-generation through the dialectical method. Ideally, this is all consciously done. So the cyborg is not made of mud. So it's a subtle distinction. Obviously, mud being materialist is a little bit of a problem for being material is something that they would want to distinguish themselves from when you understand that the framework is in total opposition and inversion to Judaism and Christian, specifically Catholicism. So perhaps that is why I want to see the cyborgs can subvert the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust in the manic compulsion to name the enemy. So this one is a little bit more difficult, but the idea of cyborgs subverting the apocalypse of returning to nuclear dust is the idea of overcoming death. It's the idea of immortality through technology. It's the if you have read at least some of the opening passages of the Bible, certainly up to the part with the Tower of Nimrod, there is a hierarchy delved out of the word, and there's a certain sequence, and so the word is with God. God names creation. God names Adam. Adam is given the word to name Eve. But interestingly, when you have the passages on the Tower of Babel, the people speak with common. They have a common language and they have a common speech. So their means of communication are all united, but they all speak as one. And so obviously combined with the Tower of Babel, the idea is to collapse the distance between God and the human, but also to be able to build a tower which is so great and so high that it can survive the flood and overcome God's powers. So it's the idea to basically turn the word of the collective against the word of God. And so this is why you get this subtle reference. How consciously performed, I'm not sure, but the compulsion to name the enemy. So of course it depends who you're referencing here as the enemy. With that enemy here referring to God. And I think those are all fair deductions, given that the context is quite clear in its references to Garden of Eden, divinity, rebellion. So we understand all of these themes. If there's even a rudimentary understanding of the Judeo-Christian tradition, or if one has read Milton's Paradise Lost. So the cyborg appears in myth precisely where the boundary between human and animal is transgressed. Far from signaling a walling off of people from other living beings, cyborgs signal disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling. Bestiality has a new status in this cycle of marriage exchange. Again, this is quite interesting. So on the previous slide, I mentioned how the cyborg is essentially a chimerical being, offspring of Typhon and Echidna. So here it's interesting to see that the cyborg appears in myth precisely where the boundary between human and animal is transgressed. Of course, if you go and cast your mind back to mythology, whether it's the ancient Greek mythology, whether it's Egyptian mythology, Babylonian, in various types of mythology all throughout the world, particularly those of more pagan traditions where there's multiple deities of Hinduism, for example, there is there's often a stage of religious conception where the deities are half beast or part beast and then part human. There's a very interesting thesis on this by I think it's Eric Neumann, student of Carl Jung, called The History and Origins of Consciousness, and he explores the development in religious traditions from the round, the Ouroboros, to the world parents who are split. There's masculinity and femininity represented in mythology, to then various other kinds of deities. You've got the animal-human deities, and then later forms of deities, such as, as in purely human, and then ultimately you would then have Christ. So moving in the backward direction, you would go from the human towards the monad, and it's useful to understand the movement in this fashion because that's the intellectual framework in which it takes place, and those are the concepts you need in order to understand what's being said. So it makes sense that the cyborg in a way is moving beyond humanity, but likewise is something which is no longer human. So it's no longer bounded with the ideas, concepts, knowledge, methodologies, morality, and societies that are characteristic of humans. So if you can imagine that you could make a human a cyborg, then it's possible also to integrate that same technology in a sense into an animal. And so there would then be a commonality between those animal cyborgs and those human cyborgs. I think this idea, I can't remember when Derrida wrote Beast and the Sovereign, but it's quite a similar idea. He has this idea of divine animality, so it's the union of the divine, the human, and the animal. And he was talking about how once you collapse the distinction between human and animal, you return to a ground where there's no distinction between what is good and what is evil. So you're collapsing the ideas and the frameworks that humans are using, and you've moved into that of a divine animality. Whereas here we're seeing a different collapse of boundary between human and animal. That's the idea of transgressing the boundary between them. It's the dialectical synthesis. That's why you transgress the boundary between male and female in queer theory. You've collapsed the new categories together, which all it means is that you've kind of, in this case, you would be just moving to a different category and holding your analysis there, and then teaching people at that level of category resolution. So you might teach children that they are not different from animals, and that would be a very highly materialist but also very unethical system. Of course, with post-structuralism, they'd say that's just my viewpoint. My subjective viewpoint has no inherent value over anyone else's, but nonetheless they would also attribute power to me, and then use that as the reason to use force to enact the revolution. So of course, when we come to the latter part of the paragraph, cyborgs signal disturbingly and pleasurably tight coupling. I mean, that is a fairly crude reference. You can have sexuality in the kind of creative sense, so that you could argue that you have a sexual union of sorts on a certain level when you read a book and you integrate the ideas. There's a kind of there's a creative principle that has come together in synthesis there. But here, it's kind of hard to make an allusion towards a higher kind of synthesis or sexual union being the one that's referred to when it's fundamentally describing itself as materialist. Bestiality doesn't necessarily have to mean sex with animals, but I'm not sure there's the sufficient threshold that's excluded from the understanding that's offered in this paragraph, particularly when it's referencing to marriage exchange. So the goal, obviously, of technological development here would be to be capable of representing all of reality on some level. So it's the digital representation of all things, and to then exchange biological processes and restrictions for those that are digital. So a cyborg, quite fundamentally, is a dialectical being. So it gets rid of the organic and technical distinctions. We also see the thread where it is collapsing the human and the animal. So you know that this is the dialectical system because it's trying to get rid of all the contradictions possible, and you can see some of the disjointedness and problems in the thought when the idea is to move forward with technology, but then to simultaneously integrate animals into that same entity. I mean, animals don't develop technology. But of course, the idea might be is with enough technological innovation, they might generate something or other. I don't know. It's just too horrifying. But hey ho, that won't stop the dialecticians. It quite clearly has a theological component. I mean, that's an explicit thesis in there. So it's the blasphemy of the self-worship and self-religion. It's the rejection of God. It's the overcoming of death, and so on and so forth. Of course, once you've got all the contradictions resolved and all entities which survive the various revolutions and things like that are integrated into a monolithic cyborg, then you've got your consciousness all united and able to access one another and examining one another in this dialectical dance. And then it self-organizes by writing. So the idea there is obviously once you've got the digital representation of reality, you've negated all of the various biological controls of things like this. You've got the principles. You can, through data and through information, influence and direct that self-generative principle that lies at the core of dialectical philosophy. So rejoicing in the illegitimate fusions of animal and machine. So animal, of course, can refer to human when you're conceptualizing human and machine, but likewise it can also refer to animals. Feminisms and Marxisms have run aground on Western epistemological imperatives to construct a revolutionary subject. So what's that? All that's saying is that the old forms of feminism and Marxism, they didn't yet have access to post-structuralism. Post-structuralism breaks apart the present structure. Part of the present structure is the understanding that there is actually something such as a human, which is distinct, which is, whilst it can be described as a form of animal in certain respects, it is inherently different to an animal. Whereas here, the argument is post-structuralism has allowed dialectical philosophers to recognize that the knowledge, the concepts that are used, the language to speak about things, the statements that people have made, the association of concepts with words, these are all underpinned by power. They're all false. You've got to get the correct alchemical iteration of each of them. But these are in this process, it's fundamentally going to undo the understanding of what is human. So now the type of revolutionary subject is entirely different in this generation versus the prior. So you could already see this movement between Marx and Engels, who had the proletarian, Gramsci, who had the subalterns. That was wider groups. It didn't just need to be people who had just heard the Marxist literature. It's like you go and find all of the outcasts of society, you teach them that they're victims, that they're oppressed upon, and you coagulate them together as part of the revolutionary movement. So you and obviously you can also prey on people's do-gooder inclinations. It's like, oh yes, I would like to help these people who are victims, but what they're not conscious of is the broader philosophical framework and its ideas and demands that issue is attached to, and then obviously this can be turned against society. This is not just literary deconstruction, but liminal transformation. That was a comment I made in my book. Deconstruction is only within the bounds of the text. So, you deconstruct a text, but if you're actually going to put these things into practice, then you're going to need to do something which is out with the text, whether that's your cognition. And if you're obviously going to implement these ideas any broader, then you're going to need to go beyond the text. If you really deconstruct to the point where the only language left is to speak verbally one's emotions to one another or to represent things pictorially, then you're obviously going to have to move deconstruction beyond just text. So that's why here, whilst Derrida said one thing one way, it was already prefigured in his system that it would go beyond the text. That's why I think he's one of the manifestations of his deceit. And here you can see it manifested as being something which is practically going to reform society, but at the most fundamental level to reform humanity. So one of the other interesting things, and this is a more recent development, is the idea that the Anthropocene, so this is the age of human activity, technological development, influence on the world, might be reconceptualized as the Cthulhu scene. Now, the reference here is to H.P. Lovecraft's Cthulhu, which is a water deity. It's a deity which is cruel, fear, inspires despair, is destructive. Cthulhu is not a nice deity, but this is reframing the past as obviously something that was cruel and horrifying, inspires terror. So of course, when we understand this in the context of her broader body of work, the Cthulhu scene is associated with the epoch of humanity. It is the pre-cyborg. So it's an era of cruelty and harm and terror, destruction, being a water deity. If you're following some of the ideas of Jung and Neumann and the psychoanalytics, then the water is also a reference to emotion and the unconscious. So we can see how, you know, the perception at a certain level is to look at the human as an unconscious entity, which again fits very nicely with the dialectical philosophy. It's all about raising consciousness, but the eco-feminist aspect is drawing on ideas of Naga, Gaia, Tangaroa, and there's a host of other deities that are listed. They're all feminine water deities, but at least in the older forms of mythology, these deities, you know, they're not all good. They are like nature, just as Caroline Merchant says, or observed of the cultural representations of nature is not. It can be viewed as good, it can be viewed as bad, but nature is harsh either way. And this here is, if you're reconceptualizing the old era as something that's horrifying, then you want to overcome it. But if you're also establishing kin, so kin is this another form of moving beyond humanity. So the cyborg was one idea. Kin here is a slightly different idea, but the kin, which is no longer human, is not restricted by a conception of identity that humans or you and I would be used to. So the idea is that kin can include those deities, so you can actually have integrated into your identity and your concept of yourself, providing you go through this dialectical framework and understanding, you have deities or different forms of pagan deities. Potentially there might even be new pagan deities which are generated, which are become part of your entity. So again, it's that kind of idea where you touch the divine, but whilst obviously from the previous work you're holding yourself in rebellion against God. So you're using different forms of divinity against divinity, whilst being materialist. You know, it's all a bit messy, but this is the way they think. I am a compostist, not a post-humanist. We are all compost, not post-human. Make kin, not babies. So this is a different kind of thread from the cyborg aspect. It doesn't necessarily mean the cyborg aspect's being repudiated. It's just coming at things from a slightly different angle. If you're looking at the strict organic, then the organic can die. So this is how we are all compostist. You've got these dialectical layers, and things die and new things are grown, but so you make kin, not babies. The idea is not, again, and that's the cyborg aspect coming through, is the not having the different genders and the heterosexuality. So you're not creating, you're not going having a spouse and then bringing life into the world. You're recruiting. That's what making kin, not babies, means. Is you take other people's children or animals and you integrate that into your new kin. And your sense of identity, and that's how you can get something like multi-species eco-justice. You're moving beyond just a form of social justice for humans, specifically for dialectical revolutionaries. You're now looking at justice for species, for being farmed and eaten, and so on and so forth. So what that necessarily looks like, I think you can probably just let your mind run fairly wild at, you know, what previous dialectical regimes such as the Soviet Union and Mao's China and Pol Pot's Cambodia have all done, and just integrate animals somewhere in that process, and you'll probably, already be well into, somewhere, something you could write up as a dialectical paper and no doubt submit to a certain journal and probably get published. So from human to post-humanity. Rosie Braidotti likewise has quite similar ideas. So again, there's a rejection of the notion of a human. And there's also a new monism which is established. So this is wanting conformity between body and mind, the nature and the culture. So we've got that principle of reflection of the relation to the material world through the body and into the mind. But likewise, this relation should be reflected in culture, and it's got to be more in harmony with nature. We're getting really into the environmentalism here, and it's certainly materialist. So the idea is to reject human exceptionalism. It's, we're just a form of animal with slightly different capabilities, but that doesn't give us any inherent value over any of the other animals. So obviously, humans using animals, or humans using animals, animal husbandry and things like this. These are causes for a need for non-human social justice. Social justice which is beyond a human conception, and you can quite easily see the complement to Haraway's ideas. So one of the things which naturally becomes integrated into this is the idea that the animals have their own discourse, and of course an animal is not capable of speaking in verbal propositions like we do, though I think they do have consciousness and can make choices, and they obviously have emotions. So there's the idea that on their behalf dialectical philosophers would begin to constitute a discourse, and likewise if you're collapsing the distinction, so you're making kin, you're integrating them with technology, the cyborg, there's perhaps the only real fundamental things I think you're probably going to find in a discourse for animals which rejects the notion of humanity and private property and so on and so forth is that this relationship is emotional, it's been inherently abusive, there's a need to take accounts and to ensure that certain things never happen again. So I wouldn't be surprised if you also saw things like vegetarianism pop up, or the ability to have more intimate relationships with animals and so on and so forth. These are the kinds of things that are latent within the principles here established. So it's a relational collective that involves non-human actors and technological media. So again, that's quite clear. So subjectivity can then be redefined as an expanded self whose relational capacity is not confined within the human species, but includes non-anthropomorphic elements. Zo, the non-human, vital force of life, is the transversal entity that allows us to think across previously segregated species, categories and domains. So again, we're seeing the dialectical synthesis between humans and animals, between humanity and nature, so on and so forth. And so it's driven by a sense of meaning, and it's called vital neo-materialism. Now that sentence is quite important because even Marx, I think it was in his Economic and Philosophic Manuscripts 1844, described his system as vital. So that word, obviously through translations and things like this, emphasizes the living, organic aspect that is common to the thread of dialectical materialist philosophy. Canguilhem, obviously very important in developing his ideas around vitalism as well, also materialist. So here, vital neo-materialism, it should quite clearly stand out exactly what's being got at. Obviously this is why I've included it, so on and so forth. So all figurations are localized and hence immanent to specific conditions. So this is just stating that the various epochs of history, you're going to have a certain form of consciousness, a certain form of structure. You can be immanent to them, so you can have awareness of the correct materialist relationship to the material world within your historicist epoch, and then in conformity to that, you're going to have a whole load of institutions, ideas, forms and concepts and essences and ideas of all of these things, but they're rendered into material practices. These are all linked together, and so you've got older forms of materialism, be it Marxist, be it in the neo-Marxist era, being through the dialectical evolution into post-structuralism, and then now we're getting into the establishment of new kind of, hey, this is new projects, these are where we need to collectively locate our sense of meaning, so on and so forth. So cyborg, new human, non-human linkages, new zoontologies. Again, it's the same theme of uniting with animals, and zoontologies. It's a play on words for ontology being conception of being, nature of reality. Zoontologies would be, okay, well, what's the conception of being, the experience of reality for an animal, for the cyborg? The empathic bond to non-human, including monstrous and alien others, has become a post-human feminist topos. So this is just the Greek word for a literary theme. So a post-human feminist topos is the empathic bond between the non-human, the monstrous, and the alien others. So between you as a post-human feminist, a post-feminist, whatever you want to call it, post-human feminist, and monstrous and alien creatures. So you're integrating into your conception of yourself, you're integrating into the understanding of the world, you're integrating into your relationships, you're integrating into your utterances. So that's your actions, but your verbal utterances. So these are different kinds of praxis, and they have the alien and the monstrous integrated into them. So you're seeing again the aggressive side which comes forth within the dialectical philosophy. So even if the strategy at the present day is far more cunning, which is by using people's moral and ethical intuitions and desire to not necessarily see other beings suffer, to use that against people, and then of course once in power, it's possible that all of these latent aggressive aspects which drive the movement explicitly can then come to the fore and be enacted. So there's a requirement for new forms of humanities. So this is studying not only humans but animals, and then dialectically integrating the knowledge had of those different things, examining the suffering, with the victimhood of the animal by the human, and to start developing essentially entire disciplinary areas. So if we're talking in a Foucauldian sense, these would be entire discursive areas, which then look to change the way that people understand themselves, animals, technology, their relation, and what all of those need to be used for, what particular dialectical goal is deemed acceptable at a certain period in time, and of course the explicit knowledge of having moved past the lower form of humanity to a higher alchemical form of humanity. So yes, there's an entire need to completely change the universities and the contents and what is taught, what contents are taught in the universities, and to start establishing this idea of the post-human. Neo-materialist immanence expands this collective ability to the sustainability of our modes of knowledge production. So the idea being, you obviously have a certain form of consciousness, you've got a relation to the material world, you're conscious of your material relation to the world, it's in the dialectical and historicist form, and this recognises the collective union between different aspects of identity, between or the things which constitute the revolutionary collective, their aspects of identity, so that they work together and then sustainably create knowledge. So the idea is creating knowledge, so it's doing philosophy, it's coming up with theories, ideas, universals, and then going on and ensuring that they're implemented, that it becomes the governing thought process of society. So you get everyone to buy into your fantasy, your manipulation, or the manipulation, the fantasy of the dialecticians. So driven by Zoe-centered egalitarianism, aka monistic vitalism. Of course, we're now monistic vitalism. It should be quite clear to see that that's the non-contradiction which then exists in the material realm at the end of history, at the end of the various revolutionary movements. So again, the monism, the monad in Marxist system resurfaces now, having gone through the dialectical evolutions of Labriola, Gramsci, Marcuse, and then the ideas of the Frankfurt School. So that's where we're starting to get the influence of Nietzsche coming in, the more individualist. That grows to quite strong fruition in Derrida and Foucault, Sartre. But these are ultimately subduing the individual aspect to the broader collective revolutionary tradition. And then going through the post-structuralism, we then start to see ideas of reconstituting or moving beyond humanity as a whole, and having environmentalism, so that, the ecological aspect, collapsing the distinction between human and animal, having philosophy and ideas, means of communication, means of relating to others, and having relationships which reflect this new kind of humanity. All of these are coming together to generate a new monistic vitalism. So there's that monad again at the end. It's just that whereas Marx mapped out a certain pathway to get to it, which with communism, and then having the construction in consciousness of socialism, and then having that or practicing the construction of socialism and the awareness that you are the collective, which is reintegrated divinity and is constructing itself for itself by itself. That being your socialism. Here at the end, you're again going to have essentially the same system, because you are reintegrating as part of socialism the understanding that everything is part of a monad. So that's why you get your Zoe-centered egalitarianism, your biological, materialist, life-centered egalitarianism. You're collapsing the distinctions between all life. So you're undoing essentially a lot of Western philosophy and how we come to understand things, and then displacing this for the dialectical methodology. Of course, it doesn't need to be conformist to reality. It's just you state it over and over and over. It's propaganda driven. Remember, propaganda is the first end of the communist workman. So it's just the same as that. That's why these ideas are taught as as Gnostic fact in university instead of being challengeable. It's just the propaganda over and over and over. And then, just state that this is the way the world is and get people to act based on that. Don't make them open to genuine debate and ideas, because if they actually engage their brains for a second, then even some rudimentary thought and ideas would overturn some of the dialectical extremist ideas. So this results in new alliances between environmentalists and legal specialists, indigenous and non-Western epistemologies, First Nation peoples, new media activists, IT engineers, anti-globalization forces, which constitute a significant example of new political assemblages. So it's basically just everybody, every post-human and their dog, coming together to undo the ideas, knowledge, institution, society, practices, behaviors and habits, and so on and so forth, which stand in the way of creating the monistic vitalism and the levelling of all material existence. And so as part of this, dialectically, you grab everything and you need to reform all aspects of reality dialectically, giving them antitheses and then synthesizing something new, bringing them into that mediating revolutionary stage, which is going to be something which is beyond human, but which is still part human, and then you again begin that dialectical synthesis to move to being a complete post-human. So whether it requires epistemologies from, First Nation peoples, well, those would be epistemologies which are typically more animist. So you've got your religious aspects, you've got media activists, so you've got religion being put through law, media, through the university, for example, represented in programming. All of these kind of different aspects. There's a lot of stuff that you can read into there, or stew on in that area, but it's fundamentally manipulating people's knowledge, people's moral systems, in order to get them to behave differently and to move towards that monistic goal. There's a doing away with cognitive capitalism, and if we just stop for a moment and think about the idea, capitalism presupposes the ability to have private property and to trade, and there are obviously property rights and free movement, which are all prefigured in this, that there is a human who can own property. Now, of course, based on what we've seen, if you're going past the idea of a human, then you might be going past the idea of a human subject who can own property. Likewise, if you're going past the human to the post-human, then you're not necessarily going to have a concept of the human who can own property. So you attack it on different levels. Cognitive, obviously referencing what's in people's minds, the process of thinking. So you're getting rid of the idea, through constituting these new disciplinary areas, these post-humanities, these discourses, that there is a kind of cognitive capitalism in place. This means that even the forms of cognition themselves are subjected to a kind of, or permeated by a kind of cognitive labour, a kind of cognitive fetishism, and these things in turn need to be dialectically undone, reformed, and then turn towards the kind of correct cognition. And of course, for the correct cognition, for the right knowledge and the right action, the right consciousness, you're going to need to undo the capitalism and replace it with historicism, dialecticalism, having a concept of the post-human, so on and so forth, everything that's been in this video. So the dialectical methodology creates the knowledge, and the humans, the animals, the cyborgs, or the post-humans, I should say, the animals and cyborgs are all dialectical entities now engaging with one another, and then partaking in that sexual, creative, dialectical act of reforming everything around them as well as themselves. So all human and non-human entities are nomadic subjects in process, in perpetual motion, imminent to the vitality of self-ordering matter. So obviously that statement should be pretty clear at this point. New forms of human nature are posited, reflected in the revolution in academic study. Again, this is just a reference back to something I've done in my book, which is showing how the academy, contriving these various new systems and means of looking at reality, can induct people into that system, and then the academics use it to essentially outmaneuver the existing values and conceptions of the world in society, and then generate for themselves a sense of meaning. Potentially replacing religion with their own personal philosophy, and then trying to induct as many people into making sure it happens. So they can even go to their deathbed with a sense of contentment that the revolution is going to continue long beyond them. And of course, the point is to compose a missing people. So in the context of the alchemical transformation from one form of humanity, or trying to extract the shard of the divine within from the muddy surroundings, this should be quite clear, and we've obviously got the aspects of animals and things like this included into that missing people. The last 2 points to cover, Judith Butler recognises that when you've got the monadological endpoint that inorganic nature is essential to humanity, but humanity is also essential to nature. And that's obviously very clear in Marx's early works, but her point is that this can be mobilized for environmental politics. So what we recognize here is one of the many explicit manifestations of Marxism, neo-marxism, post-structuralism, post-humanism now being integrated into environmental politics. So you're going to have this element of all of the ideas that we've previously seen can be integrated into environmental politics, but Butler wasn't necessarily referring to Haraway and Braidotti's theses. The main point being that the union between humanity and nature and the monad at the end of history can be mobilized for environmental politics. This means that alongside, as I've been saying, any kind of concerns that you may or may not have for the environment, irrespective of whatever kind of information is being generated by scientific methodology, which is valid and consistent over time, which takes account of trends of history, you know, whether it's from the medieval ice age to the present day, whether we're continuing our movement out of the ice age, or whether, you know, what degree is anthropogenically influenced, so on and so forth. Nonetheless, there is the fact that Marxism can be used for environmental politics, and specifically that relational connection between humanity and nature can be used. And then you also have the idea of Bruno Latour, who states openly to establish animism anew. So this is again an explicit movement towards the regeneration of religious and faith aspects into the dialectical tradition, and specifically to create something which has a relation to the Communist Manifesto. So again, it's always important to look at which kind of concepts are useful here. Recognizing the dialectical movement, the Communist Manifesto would have been an older historicist manifestation, but this has been dialectically reformed. So you go from the original Communist Manifesto, which has its roots in the economic and philosophic manuscripts and the German ideology and the other early works of Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels. There's obviously a lot of philosophical developments which have taken place since then. This possesses a relation to it, so there's a dialectical form of it which is explicitly making use of animism. So you know that with all of these different threads coming together, that essentially within the academy the turn is towards the religious, whether animist or otherwise, or the original Marxism, which is the inversion of Catholicism. So it's the academies becoming essentially dialectical seminaries. So if we have a summary, Marx's original system made use of a proletariat. Gramsci's development of this was the subaltern. This was to make use of any kind of groups which were rejected by society and integrating them into the revolutionary movement. When we come to the post-structural thinkers, we get Derrida's divine animality. We have the cyborg kin, post-human. So it's quite clear that this is going to fundamentally change the understanding of the world, society, morality, decision-making, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, the knowledge of this is completely certain because of the dialectical methodology and historicism, but we also see the explicit revival of religious aspects in the Marxist movement, but this should not be a surprise given that the system itself is religious. These are the works cited, and thank you once again.